Okay, so let's just jump right in. There are a handful of documents in all of human history that have had the kind of earth-shattering impact that Paul's letter to the Romans has. I mean, this is a text that has literally sparked revolutions, reshaped civilizations, and in many ways, built the world we know today. But what if we've only been seeing a tiny fraction of its true message this whole time? And look, this isn't just some abstract idea. The power of this letter is a historical fact. For Martin Luther, a single verse in Romans was enough to ignite the entire Protestant Reformation. He said it felt like walking through a gate to heaven. It completely reoriented his world, and because of that, it reoriented the world for millions of people. That just shows you the kind of power that's packed into these pages.
And that leads to a really interesting question. The Reformation, for good reason, zeroed in on these huge ideas like justification by faith. But in the process, did we kind of put blinders on? Did we start reading this massive panoramic letter through the tiny keyhole of just a few really important debates and maybe miss the bigger picture Paul was trying to paint?
So this is where we get to the heart of what we're exploring today, which is based on the work of theologian Dr. Dale Morrow. The big argument is that Romans is so much more than just a formula for how to get saved. It's really this grand story about God's faithfulness, about the incredible, intertwined destiny of Israel and the rest of the world, and it's a blueprint for a whole new kind of humanity.
Now, this is where it gets really wild. The paper suggests that some of our most core theological ideas, we're talking ideas that have been set in stone for over 1,500 years, might actually be built on a slight misunderstanding, maybe even a simple mistranslation of what Paul originally wrote. So let's dig into that first major crack in the foundation. It all revolves around one of the biggest questions you could ask. What did we actually get from Adam's sin? Seriously? Just think about that for a second. The traditional Western view has been that we're all born already guilty of what Adam did. But this paper presents a different option. What if what we inherited wasn't his legal guilt, but his condition, his mortality, the state of being cut off from life itself? Okay, so, believe it or not, this huge theological fork in the road comes down to two tiny little words in Romans 5:12. See, when the original Greek was translated into Latin, the phrase ho, which pretty clearly means because, was translated as in quo, which means in whom. And that little switch changed everything. Death spread because all sinned became death spread in whom, that is, in Adam, all sinned. Suddenly, it sounded like we all sinned back then, inside of Adam. And you can just watch the dominoes fall through history. That 4th century Latin translation by Jerome becomes the text that Augustine uses in the 5th century to build his whole doctrine of original guilt. And from that point on, boom, the idea that every single person is born legally guilty for Adam's crime gets locked into the very foundation of Western Christian thought for the next 1,500 years. All right, let's move on to the next major piece of this puzzle. Because this rereading doesn't just stop with sin and death, it also totally reframes how we understand maybe the two most important words in the entire letter, faith and righteousness. You know, when you and I hear the word faith today, we usually think of it as a mental thing, believing that certain facts about Jesus are true. And that's often how we understand the Greek word pistis. It's that moment of decision that kicks off our salvation. But the argument here is that for Paul, a Jewish thinker steeped in the Old Testament, pistis was so much bigger than that. It was about believing loyalty. Think of it as a total, ongoing allegiance of your entire being to God, kind of like a citizen's loyalty to their true king. It's less of a one-time transaction and more of a complete transfer of allegiance.
And this right here is an absolute game changer. That famous Greek phrase in Romans 3 can be translated as faith in Jesus, sure. But a much more likely reading in context is the faithfulness of Jesus. So what does that mean? It means our standing with God isn't based on how strong or perfect our faith is. It's grounded in the perfect, unbreakable, completed faithfulness of Christ himself. Our loyalty is just a response to his finished work. It's not the thing that triggers it.
And what's cool is that this richer view of faith also blows up our picture of the atonement. It's not just a legal transaction. Paul uses this whole symphony of metaphors to describe what happened on the cross. He talks about reconciliation. That's relational. He talks about redemption. That's about being freed from slavery. And he talks about the cosmic defeat of sin and death. It's not just fixing a spreadsheet in heaven. It's a full-scale rescue mission on every possible level.
Okay, so now we're wading into what are, let's be honest, probably the most notoriously difficult chapters in the whole letter, Romans 9 through 11. These chapters have often been read as God picking and choosing which individuals get to be saved. But what if that's not even the main question Paul is trying to answer?
The paper makes this really critical distinction. In Paul's world, election and salvation aren't the same thing. Israel was absolutely God's elect people, but that election wasn't a guarantee that every individual Israelite would be saved. They were elected for a mission, a job to do. They were chosen to be the people through whom God would bless the entire world. And the proof? Just look at Israel's own history, like the exile, where God's chosen people face judgment for not being faithful to their mission.
So, get this. Here's the really mind-bending part of the argument. From this perspective, Israel stumbling over their Messiah wasn't a failure of God's plan. It was the strange, tragic, but divinely orchestrated way that the doors of God's family were thrown wide open to the rest of us, to the non-Jewish world. It was the very thing that fulfilled God's ancient promise to Abraham, that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed.
All right, so after 11 chapters of this mind-blowing epic theology, Paul suddenly seems to shift gears, right? He starts talking about practical, everyday life. But the argument here is that this isn't a shift away from theology to morality. No, it's the logical, unavoidable result of everything he just said.
What Paul lays out in these final chapters isn't some optional to-do list for the super spiritual. It's what a community of people actually looks like when they believe the story he just told. It's the lived-out proof. It's the tangible, real-world evidence that the gospel is true and has the power to create a whole new kind of humanity.
And what's the blueprint for this new way of life? Paul puts it right here on the screen for us. It's the pattern of Jesus himself. For Christ did not please himself. The entire ethical vision of Romans is built around this self-giving, others-first, enemy-loving pattern of life that Jesus lived out all the way to the cross. So the big takeaway here is that every practical command, how you deal with disagreements in the community, how you relate to the government, how you treat your enemies, it all flows from this one central source. It's a community that is constantly shaped by the strange and powerful pattern of a crucified Lord.
You know, in the end, after laying out this gigantic cosmic story spanning all of history, Paul doesn't wrap it up with a neat little bow. He just erupts in worship. He's completely floored by the sheer scale and genius of God's plan. He recognizes that the only right response to a mystery this deep isn't to try and master it, but to stand back in awe.
And it really leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Paul wrote a letter that was big enough to tell the story of the whole world. This exploration suggests that for a very long time, we might have been trying to cram that massive story into a much smaller box. It makes you wonder, not just about Romans, but about any great text. What do we discover when we finally step back and try to see it at the full, breathtaking scale its author originally intended?